Well, welcome. We're here, and we're ready for a presentation today. I have just a very short introduction for you. I would talk to the group earlier about you when you were able to join us the first time, and of course, as I mentioned in the emails. I had mentioned to them that you had been in the Sudan several times and you were on a recent trip. So we're really hoping to hear about that from you. But everyone, welcome Jérôme Tubiana. He's an advisor to the refugee issues for Médecins Sans Frontières, or Doctors Without Borders. He has reported for 25 years on the conflicts of displacement across the Horn of Africa and the Sahara. And is the author of award-winning graphic novel Guantánamo Kid. He's published articles in the New York Review of Books, in foreign policy, in the Baffler, in Libération, and many places, both working with general, just kind of feature pieces, but also has been working with several artists for graphic presentations. We were lucky to have published some of his pieces, or one of his pieces, in the Michigan Quarterly Review, which I sent you, and hopefully we'll be doing more. But he's really kind of a trailblazing, fearless journalist, working both as an advisor to Médecins Sans Frontières and writing his own work been doing so for a long time. And it was my pleasure to have been his companion on the rescue boat 2 years ago in 2022, and I sent you the piece titled "The River," which we co-wrote and was published also in English in the New York Review of Books. So please welcome Jérôme. He will be discussing the Mediterranean again. Which we've also covered with some other speakers. But as he's been in the Sudan, he'll be also talking about that as well. So welcome, Jérôme. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Khaled. So actually, well, I'll try to divide that talk in two parts. Yes, part of my work has been to tell stories of migrants and refugees, and that will be the first part of my talk. And also, since 20 years, I've been trying to cover the war in Sudan. And I'm just back from Darfur in Western Sudan. As Khaled mentioned, I will try to tell you about what's happening there too, as a second part of my talk. The link between both is that I've been telling a lot of stories of Sudanese refugees. And it's also been a way to talk about the war in Sudan through their voices. So I don't know if you can see that first slide of mine. Yeah, I think you see it. It's mostly to introduce you a bit to what I'd like to discuss first, and which is actually an ongoing discussion I've been having with different colleagues, especially those who are, let's say, a little bit pessimistic, and some of my colleagues in the humanitarian world, but also in the academia, in the media, they are increasingly raising the question of a supposed fatigue about the topic of migration issues. So that was my own interrogations about this. Are we really tired of somehow repeating the same thing, or is there in those professions a belief that the public has grown tired of the subject? Or is it our own fatigue, or fatigue from the journalists, which is more visible than actually, I think, that from the public? I don't have any evidence that the public is getting tired of those stories. I think, on the contrary, we are still sensing a continuing interest within the public and the media. I can say, as MSF, Doctors Without Borders, we frequently receive requests from the media to tell them what we are seeing, especially on the routes, on the migration routes across Africa, but also other places across the Mediterranean as well, of course. And well, some of these requests may look more interesting than others, but also sometimes we can also provoke interest from the media. So people are asking us, of course, if we are not tired of writing the same articles over and over again. I'm not sure those are exactly the same articles. There was always something new, but I think there's a twofold problem. One part of the problem of our own fatigue, I would say, rather hails from the fact that we still believe that, we are heirs of a time, actually, when it looked very somehow easy to provoke change by quite simple writing. A time when on almost any great, let's say, invisible cause, for instance, the cause of remote political prisoners. Now I'm thinking in particular, since a few days, there is one very famous French Algerian writer called Boualem Sansal, who's been arrested in Algeria. And clearly the way people are trying to raise the alarm about his case reminds the way that we used to do like 40 years ago. And that was a time where you just had to write an op-ed. I'm thinking in particular by op-eds by Jean-Paul Sartre, typically about similar cases of political prisoners. And they could quickly lead a government to take action, or at least pretend to do so. And at times, literally, the political prisoner could even be released, apparently on the basis of that simple mobilization, a petition or an op-ed by a famous writer, or by a famous writer, or by a group of writers thinking the same. So we can probably feel very much disillusioned today from the fact that that particular op-ed form by intellectual figures has really become far too common to actually make any difference. There are dozens of op-eds every day of that style. Everyone has been writing them since then, and not necessarily in the style of Sartre, but yes, you can always imitate him. And there's also been calls along the lines of, at the time of Sartre, there was one very famous call in France also about the Algerian war, about Algeria as well, which was called the Manifesto of this 121, because there were 121 signatories. And it was like, it became history very quickly. Some of those signatories were famous, others were not, but they were all very much mobilized and as a result of these op-eds or petitions, individual or collective, anonymous or signed by big names. They've become terribly commonplace. They've become websites. They've become a business like Avaz or others. You could send dozens every day to the point in newspaper they have their own dedicated pages in every newspaper virtually. And actually those pages need to be filled, even if it means creating debates from the scratch. Sometimes in some paper on the left page, you have an op-ed in favor of something. And on the right-hand page, you have one against the same thing. And those columns have little effect. The wariness is understandable. So my thinking, and not only my thinking, but the thinking of many people, is that we should try actually to renew not only the content, but to renew the form. And so for me personally, but for many others as well, I think the first thing is that those op-ed were a bit short, very patronizing quite often, and we lacked space. And that's why the form known as long form or long read in the pages of normal media or in dedicated magazines has been, I think, the investment of many voices trying to be heard on important issues, human rights, humanitarian issues, war, which looked increasingly underreported. And I think that trend of the long form has gradually found its readership. Length has meant more detail, more depth as well. Perhaps it's also a way of reaching a different or larger readership possibly even a younger readership. And on the other hand, it's been also known, that form has been also known as narrative journalism, which I think is interesting as a genre, because narrative journalism is not just storytelling, but it often, you might be actually opposed to storytelling as a kind of trick, but the fact of being narrative allows you to put a strong emphasis on stories from other people, on personal accounts, such as migrants' journeys. And that itself lends particularly well to the detailed accounts of one migrant's journey, because a migrant journey, if you think of it, it's often a story of suffering, but it's also in a way a travelogue. It can be told as a travel diary. And on the slide, I'm showing you on the left a story published in the London Review of Books that you may have read, which is actually, it's called Diary, but that's not, well, that's doing well, but that's just because the London Review of Books main column for long form or on something else than books is actually called Diary anyway. But that goes well with what, in that case, that story is also some kind of journey, or diary of the journey of a Sudanese refugee who is now in France and whom I met in France a few years ago. And among the things it can tell, I think, it's about the journey, but also about how it starts. And when you collect testimonies, in particular from migrants and refugees, I think it's really important not to forget the country of origin and the reasons for leaving. And here, the person is a typical war refugee from Darfur, as most Sudanese refugees have been since 20 years. So I would not. It's one of the reasons for me to pick such an example is it's a way to evacuate from the start some of the fake debates on the reasons to leave. Yes, people have increasingly been dismissing stories of refugees as stories of economic migrants, and it's not the same thing for the normal readers. So I myself, and we can talk more about it, I tend to pick people who are undisputed refugees. And actually that refugee had his refugee status, his asylum claim was fairly easy on the grounds from his origin story, from his origin country, because unfortunately somehow asylum systems don't take into account your suffering on the journey. They take into account only your origin country mostly. So then the story goes on from the origin country about the journey itself, which you can see actually on the map that's shown on the right of the slide, which is a map that was published together with a French version of the story, journey through Libya and the Mediterranean, a very common journey, actually, the journey for thousands of refugees. Then, actually, if you read the story, you will see the story is turning a little bit more investigative, because, and it was also one of the reasons to tell the story of that particular person, is that he became a witness and he was able to identify on pictures those actors across the journey, especially in Libya, who intercepted him also, who blocked him, who made obstacles to his journey in Libya, but also who intercepted him at sea in the Mediterranean and then detained him and ransomed him before to send him back to sea. Those are actually people, well-known people from Libyan forces under the internationally recognized Libyan government. I think Khaled and our friend Tarek told you about it already. And those forces, not incidentally, have been supported by the EU for blocking migrants, by the European Union. And also, as Al-Noor's story told in the London Review of Books show, they've also been playing double game, intercepting, but in the meantime, smuggling. And this is precisely what I wanted to tell here. So yeah, this somehow is the complex message of this story is twofold. Yes, you need to know about the origin, and you need to know about the journey, and you need to know about the obstacles on the journey, and you need to know those obstacles are man-made, and they're not just local obstacles. They've been made by policies made by policymakers, and those are policymakers who are remote, who are, in that case, in Europe. I'm pretty sure you could tell the same story in the Americas, looking at policies, at border policies of the US government. But it's just one example. Maybe if you can show the next slide. I'm going to show you a few other examples, to give you an idea of the possibilities of the stories you can tell on the same topic somehow. And those are examples from the Nation. I'm sure you know the Nation. It's a weekly, pretty much from the American left, and a flagship of the civil rights movements as well from a long time, and of many other contemporary struggles. On the left, you can see an account of a detention center I visited in Libya, where mostly Eritrean refugees were detained for a very long period. And on the right, you can see an account of another individual story, an individual minor also met in Libya, and who happened to have been as well a champion runner before he left Ethiopia. He was a refugee in Ethiopia, an Eritrean refugee in Ethiopia, and he was a champion runner. Then basically at the age of 12, he won a 5,000 meter against adults. So my idea there was a little bit different. It was still the idea of highlighting a personal story, not necessarily a positive one, but with an interesting dimension to show that the refugees you met in Libya, they're not all the same. They are very different stories, but some of them are particularly talented people. And I wanted to show that it's quite unfortunate that those are just not allowed to exert their talent, in that case, sport, in a place where they could be champions. But rather that person I've been telling this story, I've been keeping in touch with him. He managed to, by chance, maybe thanks to that story, that paper, but I'm not sure. He managed to be, after many years, to be resettled out of Libya by the UN system, by the UN resettlement system led by the UN Refugee Agency, the UNHCR. And now he's in Rwanda, but it's still a long wait in a transit center in Rwanda before which he will know where he will be resettled. I would say probably in North America, maybe in Canada, because many people have been following who were resettled that way have been ending in Canada. And I mean, some of them are pretty happy now because they can at least start to rebuild their life. If you can show the third slide. The third slide is showing you actually the work Khaled mentioned and we did together at sea on a rescue vessel. So rescue vessels, NGO vessels doing rescue in the Mediterranean, they integrated that witnessing as an integral part of their mission, and in addition to rescuing. And so they've been used to take journalists or writers on each of what they call their rotation, the rotation between their port of departure in Italy and return to Italy, with usually with people rescued at sea. And usually we traveled on the Geo Barents, which has been the MSF boat since 3 years, and usually on board of the Geo Barents they take 2 journalists. And in that case, that was us. Sometimes there are 2 journalists working for the very different media. But so most of the time, those journalists are making a diary, an onboard diary. It's almost become a journalistic genre, diary on board of a rescue vessel. So much that when I first spoke to a French paper called Libération, French daily called Libération, also from the left, they told me they had already done too much of it. But I had a different idea, which was a bit not just to make a diary, but to do like a writing workshop on board. And my idea was to take Khaled on board because he is a poet, not a journalist, and because he's a Libyan poet, and maybe the only Libyan writer to have written about migration. And he's certainly been the only Libyan writer on board of a rescue vessel in front of Libya. And so the idea was to do that and to write together a two-voice diary or notebook. So we published it in Libération as a 3-part serial. What was really interesting, I think, is we wrote it and published it while we were still on board of the boat itself. And then it was followed by an English version that we published in the New York Review of Books and that you may have read. So it was another attempt to kind of renew a little bit or the classical form. If you can show the 4th slide to show you another form, well, you will recognize immediately of story, which you can sometimes publish in the same type of magazines, but it's been very much fashionable since about 20 years, especially in my country, France, but also increasingly in the US, which is the graphic reportage. So this is the first one I published in 2006 in a paper called Charlie Hebdo, which became famous now because they were the victims of an important terrorist attack a few years ago in Paris, and some of their authors and artists were killed then. But at the time in 2006, Charlie Hebdo, also from the left, was actually very much one of the first paper in anywhere to publish graphic reportage. And that one was illustrated by Catherine Meurice, who is now a very famous artist, including because she survived the terrorist attack and wrote very powerful books about her feelings after it. But that one in 2006 was just the tale of a migrant journey, another Sudanese migrant journey. Maybe one of the first, actually, Sudanese refugees to reach Europe by the sea. And so the idea was very clear at the time. It was a way to speak at the same time of the war in Darfur, which was very much underreported at the time, but starting to be reported a bit, and of asylum issues. So at the same period, graphic reportage, more under the form of books, became very famous in the US as well, with Joe Sacco, Art Spiegelman, and others. And I mean, I think there was pretty much inspiration back and forth from the US to Europe, from Europe to US. But definitely a big market in Europe for those books as well. Meaning those American books were very famous in Europe as well, and maybe even more than in the US, which is interesting to note. But possibly just because comics were selling very well in bookshops in Europe, and still are now. The genre of graphic reportage as books and within magazines, including specialized magazines, has become very, very common in France. So, and I've been actually continuing. I will show you on the next slide, maybe, a more recent publication. This is in a magazine called 2121, and they are a magazine of stories, or true stories, let's say. But there is, in each magazine, there is a graphic story of some 20 pages. And since 15 years, it's been like that. They kept that, and it's very popular, that graphic story within the magazine. So that was actually 20 pages. The story I'm showing you 2 pages of a story of an MSF project in Libya, in one particular place in Libya, whose name has been actually withheld for security reasons, because the place is pretty, well, it's in the meantime well known, but a bit sensitive. Naming it was maybe still is a bit sensitive. So the comic strip here and the drawing, because we withheld the name and the name of the people, somehow it's not so much anymore about who and where, and the graphic style is making that easy. I mean, in a graphic story, you don't need that much to know who and where. It's more about how. And here also, but still it's real. And here I used the photographs, inserting photographs in the graphic story. And after that, I did it quite a lot again in other stories, just to show that, to remind the reader that it's a graphic story. It may look a fiction, but it's actually real. And the violence also is real. So the photo is used here as a proof and as evidence, as a reminder. And if you can show the next slide is showing another graphic story, which Khaled just mentioned as well, published in the Michigan Quarterly Review, and that you may have read. It's about gold miners in the Sahara. In fact, when you travel across the Sahara, you will meet a lot of people who are coming from Sudan, from Darfur, even outside Sudan. And they can be those Sudanese, those people from Darfur, those Darfuris, they can be both migrants and gold miners, sometimes at the same time, or sometimes they have different occupations. So I started about 10 years ago, I started to follow a group of former rebels from Darfur who became gold miners since a decade. And it was a way to speak of a contemporary gold rush, something like a bit adventurous, but also, again, of the Darfur War, because these people, they were victims of that war. They also joined the rebellion, they fought. It was also a way to talk about the deadlock of that war. Like, those people fought for years, mostly they were defeated, or they didn't get the change they were hoping for. So because of that, they turned to gold. They were hopeless, and they turned to gold miners, also sometimes to mercenaries, to drug traffickers, all kind of adventurous, illicit activities. And then the story at the end is talking of the latest evolutions. That is, that gold was actually feeding the war, and in particular, it became the main business of a warlord known as Hemeti, who became the head of a huge militia called the Rapid Support Forces. And since last year, that militia has been fighting the regular army. They were working together, they were killing together, they were destroying together, they were killing civilians together. And then they started to be rival, and they are now fighting each other. And that's the new war I will tell you more a little bit about in a little bit. But typically, what was interesting in that graphic story, that also it allowed to end because, well, it's a bit less easy with a graphic story than with a simple story, because it takes a bit of time to draw. But we did our best in that story, as in other graphic stories I did, that when it's published, somehow it ends where the nearest as possible to where the news are, to what's happening now. And so that's also something not easy to do with a graphic story, but as much as you can do it, it's quite interesting to end with, because of course the story continued to move on. The story of the people are still alive, and things continue to happen in their life. Sometimes you meet a migrant in Libya, but when you publish the story, he's already crossed the sea. And so it needs some updating. And of course, when it's about a war, of course, the war is evolving as well. It's continuing. There may be more or less violence, but it's evolving constantly. Let me show you on the next slide another way to tell stories, including stories of migrants and refugees, which I've been trying with colleagues, with others. And I'm back here to strictly migrant stories. Here it's a cartoon. Those are beats, pictures from a cartoon, from an animation film. And the idea here came from colleagues working with MSF. They were looking originally for something to be shown on a screen, to be part of an exhibition at a festival. And we thought it's difficult to have good to make a good film, to make a good documentary film, sometimes it's very often too violent and you can endanger people as well. So we thought of the animation film, and I just provided the material I had, which were testimonies, but also WhatsApp messages. I kept exchanging WhatsApp messages with various people I met in Sudan, in Libya, elsewhere. And there I choose one particular character, the main character, with whom I kept exchanging for several years, over several years. And I met him first in a Libyan detention center, but then I kept exchanging with him on WhatsApp as he was crossing the sea, and then I met him again after he reached Europe. So I'm telling his story in 8 minutes from a Libyan detention center to Europe. 8 minutes for the film, but the journey was more like 8 years. And well, there was something unexpected with that story because it was very rough and experimental, and we did not believe it would make a lot of buzz, but then it was broadcast on the main European TV channel, selected in festivals, and even screened at the British Parliament in the presence of Jonas, the main character himself, and we were very happy of his presence. It had some success, and it was followed by several short films, always with some animation, but not only. And then if you show the next slide, it was followed by another graphic story. Like the same magazine I told you asked me to actually rework the film with not one, but 4 characters. So I choose 4 Eritrean refugees that I met together with Jonas, the one in the movie, in the same Libyan detention center. And their journeys to Europe were pretty much intertwined. And we followed them in the 20 pages of the story, almost only with thanks to their WhatsApp messages. So it's not quite a comic strip here, as you can see, but rather a 20-page illustrated story, but very rough, very brute, using those WhatsApp messages, which I think it's really cool. I mean, WhatsApp messages can be very poetic in a way, because they look like very short verses. They're very, depending on the style of the person as well, but they look very rough, and it's pretty interesting as well as a style. And you can get all the story together just by those messages. At times it can look a bit like a theater play, like a drama, and you have in the first page on the left, you can see the 4 characters of the story of the play, and then they speak. That's my latest example. Mostly to end with that part of my talk, there is a particular feature of all these publications is that the detailed and sometimes very raw testimony of one or more migrants is at the heart of the story. And my first observation here is that a migration story generally consists of 3 parts. If you collect one of those stories, one is the reason for departure of the country of origin. Second part is the journey, and third part is the current life in the destination country. And many publications on migrants, they tend to focus more on the second and third parts. In the publications I've shown you, as I mentioned above, the causes of departure are always mentioned, as well as the nationalities of the people concerned. Some publications will tend to blur the migrants' origins to make them appear as typical standard migrants, which seems to me a mistake and also poses a problem of respect. On the other hand, I've tended to describe the journeys of refugees fleeing war, or as I mentioned, fleeing war or political oppression generally, and there are many among the migrants I've met, because I think this has more impact in terms of changing perceptions than the journeys of migrants who simply come to Europe in search of work. But at times I've also told the stories of migrants, of migrant workers. And also I've told stories that can have those 2 dimensions. I mean, to show that you can both flee a war and dream of finding a job, of doing a particular job, of studying a particular course in university, and so on. Second observation I'd like to convey is that there is a large proportion of journalistic publications or films, fiction or documentary, who focus less on the migrants themselves than on those who help them, the helpers. We certainly felt it together with Khaled when we were on the rescue vessel. This is very true when we looked at what journalists or documentary filmmakers have produced on board of those rescue boats. It's largely devoted to the rescuers and to the boat itself. How does it work? How do you save lives? And less to the migrants who are rescued. So when we talk to producers or editors about this, they explain very clearly that their audience is essentially European, white, and they identify more easily with the white savior, the white rescuer, not to say the white savior, or even to the journalist or the filmmaker himself, who sometimes can easily become the center of the story. And it's true that, generally speaking, if we think back to some of the great movies denouncing racism, whether apartheid in South Africa, or racism in the USA, segregation in the USA, you will find out that the black hero often takes a back seat to a sympathetic white character. For instance, if you have looked at the movie called Cry Freedom by Richard Attenborough, it's about the very famous anti-apartheid activist Steve Biko. He actually dies right at the start of the film, and the story is ultimately that of the white journalist seeking to testify about Biko. So we realize now that when we take the opposite approach, telling the stories from the people themselves, by the people themselves, that I came to realize that question of identification no longer even arises. And the readers have told me that they were surprised to see how much the migrant character resembles them, how close he is to them, even if they are not migrants. So we could also extend the discussion to the question of greater empathy, including in journalistic accounts for white migrants, because there are white migrants, than for black migrants. But I don't have time to discuss too much about it, but it's been a problem I met in my own work, where some of my colleagues who tended to show more empathy for white than for black migrants, which is a major problem, I think. Third observation maybe on that work is that we can't avoid asking ourselves the question of the objective of the goal and of the risk of being counterproductive. For instance, I read recently an interview with an Italian movie filmmaker who directed a very good movie about migrants who took the sea, the Mediterranean, and he mentioned that his aim was actually to reach out to people who want to travel, to depart, and to dissuade them from making the trip. And for me, this is clearly, that should not be our goal. And it's a main problem of taking that goal, because, I mean, there are UN agencies can do it. They do propaganda movies to dissuade people to travel. But it's certainly not our job. It should not be. But on the other hand, I have to say, I find the idea that people who want to travel should be part of my audience rather interesting. And that, I mean, when I write, I think I'm trying to be read by people from the Global South. I'm hoping to be read by them. Even when I'm taking photographs, I'm trying to adopt a style that can be popular not only in the Global North, but that can be understood and read in the Global South as well. And in the idea that migrants who are the characters in a story should also be able to see it and judge it, even individual migrants, and even have a say in the writing of the story. So that's why I'm trying to keep in touch with my characters and to make them co-authors. And at times I manage to convince the editors or publishers that they can even be co-signatories whenever possible. And it's also good because, for the sake of respect, but also of accuracy of the story, involving them in the fact-checking has been very important for me and actually very productive. So these were just a few examples to convince you that there are not only many stories to tell, but also many ways of telling them, and that it's interesting to occupy that ground of the diversity of productions. Now, if you can move to the next slide, I want to show you a more classical piece, which is a foreign policy piece. I don't know which you may have read too or not, and maybe my transition here will be a little bit brutal, but it was also a way to tell you about Sudan. Well, that piece is about Sudan, but that piece is also about, and it's made from the border between Sudan and Chad, but it's also about the Sudan, the Sudanese refugees coming to Europe in even greater number since the new war started last year in 2023. So sorry for the brutal transition, but it's also a way to tell you about Sudan. I'm just back from Darfur, Sudan, as Khaled mentioned. And one of the questions I've been wondering recently, but also since a few years, is, and especially since the new war began in 2023, why is it so much underreported? And when I'm discussing this with colleagues, they have some justifications somehow or reasons. And the first reason they gave me often is that it's very complicated. Like Sudan is very complicated. Yes, it's true, it is complicated. I'm just going to maybe have to give you a little history, but not too much in a short time. But the war in Sudan, the new war as the old wars, is a story. It's a political story, but it's also a story of indigenous populations, in particular in Darfur, who are confronted by new arrivals. And there is land grabbing, but there is also a struggle for land. It's a story of somehow an internal colonization. It's a story of land occupation. Then, as I mentioned, it's a story of ethnic cleansing as well, including forced displacement. There is also, there's been extermination, and there has been an intention to exterminate, to the point that people spoke commonly about genocide or ethnic cleansing, as I mentioned, or crimes against humanity. But it's also, there's been also an intent for segregation or apartheid. This is why it's also a story with a backdrop of racism. So these are all the ingredients of that Sudanese war. And recently, it's been particularly obvious in one case in Western Darfur of one particular community, which is called the Masalit. The Masalit community is originally from Western Darfur. It is indigenous from there, but now it's mostly displaced to refugee camps in Chad. And reporting from there has been also a way to tell about their displacement, but also about it's been also a way to explain how much that Sudan story is actually a very common story of forced displacement and mass killing, because in my opinion, well, there are survivors, they are almost all displaced, and they're not about to return home. So that story can echo other stories, of course, other old or new stories, including, of course, currently Palestine, because Palestine is both an old and a new story. But there are a lot of commonalities which are important. Well, I would spare you the whole historical explication to actually focus on the latest war a bit, or the latest wars beginning in April 23. But to put it simply, and maybe we can move to the next slide with some pictures of the new war of 2023. But to put it simply, for decades, there's been a Sudanese ruling power in the capital, Khartoum, and since 1989, since 30 years, it's been an Islamic junta, and they have struggled against rebellions in the peripheries of Sudan, including Darfur, who were recruiting mostly among non-Arab communities. We label them non-Arab because it's been the main way they define their identity commonly, but they are made of many different communities. And the government in Khartoum, that Islamist junta, military junta, replied by arming Arab militias, known as the Janjaweed. And those militias were given carte blanche to target systematically non-Arab communities and eliminate them, then take their land. And the latest avatar of those Janjaweed militias has been known as the Rapid Support Forces, those forces I mentioned under that warlord called Hemeti. They have become powerful enough in recent years to challenge the army. In 2029, the regime began to face popular protests, and the army and the RSF decided to remain united and first began to kill the protesters, but then because it was quite big, they orchestrated 2 successive coups, and in between they made a facade power sharing agreement with some civilian politicians. It could not last long, and then in April 2023 they began fighting each other. And it's a war about controlling power between those 2 military bodies. So in principle, that new war should have been limited to Khartoum, to the capital, but it very soon spread to Darfur in particular. It became like a second war. The first war was for power in the capital, and the second war was the same old war between Arabs and non-Arab communities in Darfur. And then the Arab communities, they supported the Rapid Support Forces, the militias, and they took advantage of the situation to slaughter non-Arab communities, in particular that community called the Masalit, once again. Below right, you can see a mortality survey that was made during the most intense fighting month and last year. And it's showing you that the very big red column is showing you the most violent massacre in the capital of West Darfur, called Glénat, in June 2023, of that Masalit community. In fact, death estimates of the new war in Sudan nationally vary between 20,000 and 150,000 in a bit more than 1 year. And it may well be much more. And much like for the Darfur War 20 years ago, we will never know how many were killed. For most of them, we'll never know who they were, their names, and where they were buried. It's part of the price of the difficulty of reporting that war. In return for those attacks against non-Arab communities, the rebels and some self-defense militias started fighting the RSF to defend their communities. And the war is ongoing. The humanitarian situation, it became soon a disaster, including a famine. The famine has been only declared in one place, which is a displaced people camp called Zamzam. It's the only case of declared famine in Sudan. Also, there are probably many more, but it's only there that there are sufficient data. Same as for the death, the data is insufficient. And it's also, that famine is also the only of 3 recognized famines worldwide in the last 20 years. It's also the only recognized, and because it's become a bit complicated to declare a famine. Famine is not anymore a common word. It has become a technical word for which you need a lot of data, but it's very difficult to have those data in such a war. So it's a little bit of a vicious circle. Many things will never be said just because we will never get the data to use even some words like famine. Or the same could be said with some words like genocide in Darfur or other places. They are difficult to use just because they have also become legal or technical words. Let me show you the next slide. So we will never know how many died, but like 20 years ago, we know more exactly how many ran away. And so these are the few data that we have to somehow estimate how much that crisis is big. It's known as the world's worst displacement crisis currently. And indeed, more than 11.5 million people have been newly displaced. Sudan is a country of 45 million people. So it's about a fifth, a bit more. So among those 11.5 million, there are 8.5 million internally displaced. Most displaced are by force or voluntarily staying within Sudan. And then 3 million are refugees outside Sudan, including 600,000 refugees in Chad. And as could have been expected, very quickly, some of the new refugees going to Chad, they realized they went to Chad, they crossed the border, and they see already existing camps with their predecessors, those who have been in very poor refugee camps on the border with Chad for 20 years. And those people, so they understood that there will not be any return anytime soon, probably for them too. And so as a result, some continued on their way to Libya, to the Mediterranean, and to Europe. So that is something interesting, because often when people do report, they just go to one place: Chad, Sudan, Europe, Libya. And if you don't go to all those places, it's quite hard actually to imagine that when you visit that refugee camp in Chad, for instance, it's difficult to imagine that for most people, it's not their final destination, including for all those new refugees. And so that's why they continue. Many of them do continue their way. It's not the majority of them. The majority of them, they will stay in Chad or in Sudan just because it's difficult to move, it's risky, it's expensive. But there is a minority who actually move on and reach Europe. And so it's leading me, if we can show the next slide, it's leading me to address why another justification actually that's been often given of why Sudan is so much underreported. It is that it's a remote crisis. I mean, not only distant geographically, but also politically distant from the global North interests. But when you dig, actually, you find that Sudan is very much an international crisis. A crisis you will find easily about 20 international players involved, some fighting a proxy war in Sudan, making it an international war, and not that distant from the global North interest. Well, the most involved are the United Arab Emirates, but behind them there are also some Western countries, but also Russia. The Emirates are also, in the meantime, close to Russia. So we could discuss a lot about it, but we could also draw some comparisons with what's happening in Gaza, and there are definitely links. Some players involved in Gaza are also involved in Sudan. But then there is, I'm coming back to migration, because there is an obvious second interest for the global North, which is not always told, which is migration. Because Sudan is, and has been for a long time, a transit country for migrants and refugees from the whole Horn of Africa, but it's also a departure country for Sudanese refugees, as I mentioned, toward the Mediterranean and Europe. And so this is what that foreign policy story I showed you is trying to show, actually, in order to raise an alarm that with the new war, the Sudanese crisis and the so-called migrant crisis in Europe are actually merging more than ever before. We don't have much reliable figures on how many Sudanese since April 23 took the roads to the Mediterranean and Europe, but we know, as I mentioned, that it's not the majority. It's only a small share, but still several thousands, or maybe dozens of thousands. So we have that merging of the Sudanese crisis and the migration crisis, and they have appeared with those flows, but also with the fact that those flows were unusually quick. Like, for instance, in France, in Calais, in north of France, at the gate of the UK, I could meet some Sudanese who crossed the Sahara, then the Mediterranean, then France, barely a month or two after having left Sudan. It's very quick and it's unusual. Before, it took them years. What was also interesting is the reaction of Europe to the new Sudanese war. It was not particularly vocal, but still Europe recognized that it was also a refugee crisis, merging with the migration fears or the Europe's migration crisis, and that was recognized. It involved actually United Nations declarations trying to to blackmail Europe, actually, to get money for Sudan. The UN, in particular, the UNHCR, told Europe, if you don't give us money to support those people in the camps in Chad, they will not stay in Chad and they will move. So it was mostly a way to get money. It was pretty cynical, actually, and I would say very shameful, but it was a strong argument to call for funding which was really needed for the new refugees. And that actually was inadvertently helpful, because it allowed, it was also a good way to talk off the crisis in Europe. So in the meantime, Europe's reaction was a little bit ambiguous. On one side, Europe was worried that those people would come to Europe. But in the meantime, Europe started to consider Sudanese as more a priority than what they used to be. There was an evolution of asylum authorities in key countries in Europe, such as France and the UK, but also in the US, actually, with in part already in August 23. For instance, the US government extended its what's called the temporary protection status for Ukrainian on one side and Sudanese nationals. In the UK, the rate for protection or asylum for the Sudanese rose up to 98%, which is pretty big. So the comparison with Ukraine was done, but there was a key difference, is that for the Ukrainians, it was very easy to travel to Europe. And gates were open, they could take the trains freely, and they were given the protection status automatically. But because there was a European directive in particular, a new law, which is a special law for protection in case of such conflicts like as Ukraine's, but it was since 20 years since it was adopted, that law was only used once, only for Ukrainians, not for Sudanese. And there seems to be very little appetite in Europe to expand that Ukrainian exception to other countries at war. And of course, in Europe, and rightly enough, that fueled criticism against double standards. Double standards between the good white Christian refugees from Ukraine and others from the global south. And I can tell you nothing will happen. There will be no visas for Sudanese refugees granted in Chad or elsewhere. So they will still have to take illegal and dangerous routes through the Sahara and the Mediterranean. They will have to pay smugglers to cross those obstacles and get this protection. So there is obvious contradictions between some asylum system, national asylum system, are very open to the Sudanese, but on the ground, there are European Union as well as national policies, which are incredibly well funded, much more than humanitarian aid, and the aim is to block indiscriminately all migrants moving north from sub-Saharan Africa. If you want to travel south, you don't face any obstacles. But if you want to travel from north to south or from south to south, it's easy. But if you want to travel from south to north, that's where you will meet not only natural obstacles, but policy or legal obstacles. New laws made to block you. And the EU, the European Union, has been doing it through partnerships. I'm sure you already discussed this when discussing Libya, partnership with transit countries. Each time new routes open, the EU will conclude a new partnership. They did it with Libya since 6-7 years, in spite of the fact there is no proper government in Libya. Now, last year, the departures moved to Tunisia, and immediately the EU made a deal with Tunisia for $120 million. So here we touch another counter argument against the justification that Sudan is underreported, because it would not concern the global North's interests, and because it has no impact on us, and because we cannot have impact on the crisis. We can see that it does concern our interests in the North, and that it has impact in the North because it's triggering new refugee flows. it's also challenging the global North's ability to enforce its own laws and international law without double standards. The case of the Sudanese coming now is calling the global North to be fair, to apply its humanitarian laws, international law, and also it's challenging its image and its soft power capacities. So in fact, we can have impact because welcoming refugees properly is having impact in the short term. We are saving lives. And also they will send remittances home. In the long term, those remittances are often more important than humanitarian aid, and they will constitute a diaspora that will likely bring back some interesting ideas, democratic ideas, which can trigger change in their home countries in the long term. So that are some of the many ways it can actually be part of a proper policy for the global North to address conflicts which look like remote as Sudan is. So we could talk more about how the response to Sudan currently is extremely underfunded and insufficient. For instance, actually to give you a number, there's been last year a call for relief in Sudan of $4 billion, and only half have been filled with pledges from the donors. And it doesn't even mean that aid will actually reach the people in need. So, clearly that international response, and I'll conclude with that, is insufficient and insufficiently funded. Is it because, as I started to discuss from the beginning, is it because we are again facing a problem of an underreported, forgotten crisis? I'm not sure, because there is some reporting taking place, and there was in the past, and it did not necessarily bring change. But what I really know is the crisis is underreported because there's little interest for it in the global North, including from key policymakers, decision makers, in spite of local media. Local journalists are reporting it. In Sudan now, you have a clearly very strong local journalism, which is doing an incredible work. The problem is it's not of interest for our decision makers in the global North. Would it be their interest? I believed the global North journalism would follow automatically. We should not ask for the journalists to trigger interest from the politicians. I think the politicians should be able to actually get interest by themselves. I know they don't need the media. They have a lot of information and ability to get information from other sources. And then the media would follow and raise awareness among the broad public. I think it is how it worked in the past, in a few cases where we had actually some joint awareness from the public and the politics. And I'll end with that note. And please, any question? Thank you.
Is that are you unmuting us?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Jérôme. It was a great, very informative presentation. We have a few folks here who have maybe some questions to ask you. We need to wrap up in about 20 minutes, so please, anyone with questions?
I noticed in your graphic novel, you chose to supplement some real images along with the drawings. Can you speak more about that creative decision?
Sure. Well, the first thing is I'm using photography myself. I'm a photographer, and so I use photography two ways. Sometimes to document thinking of publication, but also sometimes to take notes. Rather than taking notes on a notebook, I'm taking a photograph, and so some graphic novels. I mean, when I started, I did not know really how to do graphic novels, or I was doing a reportage, and then I was turning the reportage into a graphic novel. But then lately, I started to conceive the graphic novel on the field while I was doing the reportage. And so then I started to take photographs with the idea of integrating them into the graphic novel. So mostly, as I mentioned, it's bringing you back to the reality. It's telling you that graphic novel is not a fiction. Well, by the way, in graphic stories, some authors, like in journalism, some authors of graphic stories which are supposed to be true, are taking a lot of freedom. They are fictionalizing the story in a way a journalist would not do with a purely text story. And to me, it's a little bit of a problem. So it should. I'm trying to tell clearly to my audience that I'm using, let's say, the strongest journalistic techniques, which means the text of my graphic stories, they're not invented. They've all been told by the characters. I'm not reconstituting. Even the dialogues have been told. I'm not reconstituting them. I'm not imagining them or reconstituting them as others do. So that's the reason why I'm using photograph as well, is to bring more reality and to tell the reader, okay, this is harsh reality. There is a contrast, of course, which is interesting as well graphically, between the art and the photograph. But it can work with any type of art. And I've been working with different artists, some very naive and simple, and others more realistic. Personally, I don't like too much the realistic style, but generally, photograph is working with any style, but it's color or black and white, for instance. Color photograph can work with color art, with black and white art. It doesn't matter. But definitely it works very well with non-realistic style. That's the best. And what else to say about it? Well, I'm not the only one to do that. It's been tried by others before me, and in very interesting ways. In particular, there is a famous graphic novel by a French artist working with a photographer called The Photographer. It's several volumes, and it's about the story of a real photographer who reported in Afghanistan, actually with MSF as well, with Doctors Without Borders in the 1980s. And he made very good black and white photography, but when he came back, he did not publish anything, almost, or maybe 5 pictures after a month in Afghanistan. Then what happened is he met the artist, who was already a famous graphic novelist, and they were neighbors in the same apartment, in the same building. They met, and he told him about his never published photographs, and then they decided to make a book together, and it was really, really good. I advise to read it, The Photographer, by Emmanuel Guibert, and I actually forgot the name of it, and Didier Lefebvre is the photographer. It's been translated in English, published in the US as well. I think there are a few other examples, but that's the main one, and a very good inspiration for merging photography and for putting photography into a graphic story.
Okay.
Thank you very much for your interesting talk. Can you hear me? All good?
Yes, very, very
okay. Yeah. I remember you saying that you prefer to take stories directly from people, and it's really important to hear these stories directly from these migrants. But I've heard journalists try to create distance from direct migrant testimonies due to the sensitive nature of these interviews and the chance of resurfacing potential feelings of trauma. How do you incorporate taking direct narratives while being cautious of this risk?
So actually, yeah, it's a really good question. Thank you. Actually, I'm using I worked for human rights organizations as well, and they are extra sensitive about it, at least some of them. So I used that experience to design a methodology of collecting testimonies, and specifically migrant testimonies, that I tried to have all MSF colleagues to use. And it's been a struggle. especially for the people doing communication. They don't want to use it, actually. They think it's too conservative in terms of, providing, in terms of consent and asking informed consent repeatedly, but also in terms of caution and in terms of anonymization as well. I mean, there are some number of things which are in that methodology which are indeed pretty conservative. I'm also NGOs tend to be conservative, but sometimes they tend to be conservative more about the risk for their own legal risks. Like, for instance, if a migrant is unhappy because his picture has been shown and go to court. Personally, I think that's not the real issue. The issue is not to protect yourself, but to protect the person. So in my methodology, I've been trying mostly to insist on the protection of the person and to make sure you have the consent and the person is happy all along. Well, there is a basic thing that MSF is well placed to do as well. If there is re-trauma, is to be able to provide psychological help immediately after the interview and also later on. MSF is better placed to do that than most other human rights NGOs. Many of them have that in their methodology, but they don't implement it. They cannot. But the main thing also, it's easier, especially when it's about publishing. When it's not about publishing, when it's totally confidential, I think it's okay to do it anywhere, even in detention centers. But when it's about publishing, it's always better if the person has reached its destination and has a status, as a legal status. Having said so, as MSF, when you collect testimonies, it's not just for stories, it's also to help the person, because it allows you to know better the person and to get the right type of help, including medical help, psychological help, legal help, social help that you can give. On the boat where we were, which is it's a boat under another MSF section than mine, they don't have that methodology, but they have their own rules, which are not only about protecting migrants, but also about it's something special, and we suffered a bit with Khaled about it actually when we were on the boat. Their main issue is all rescue vessels have been repeatedly accused by European governments to be connected with smugglers in Libya, especially. They've been. It's not true, but they've been court cases, and those court cases have been literally been weighing above the head of some individual rescuers, like just simple people doing rescue for years, sometimes for 8 years, until the moment they were declared innocent. And so it's really a burden, and it's really a nightmare on those boats. And for that reason, they are super conservative with who is on board. And I tried to convey that in our piece. Like, for instance, they were asking us not to communicate with anyone in Libya, like including Khaled with his family. And it's really crazy, but it's their paranoia, and we can not do anything about it. They have good reasons to be paranoid, for sure. So it was very difficult for us to deal with that. But that's one of the issues of one of the conservative issues are around collecting testimonies in different contexts, some of which are very much hot because of the pressure from outside.
They were afraid that if I contacted anybody in Libya, that could be indirectly letting them know that there is a boat, that people could be assigned to send off boats filled with refugees so that they could be intercepted by the, that I could potentially be in cahoots with the traffickers Well, yeah, but who knows? My family could be, traffickers. Yeah, if my family knew, they could make a lot of money. Who knows? Yeah. Anybody? Actually, I wanted to ask you a question, Jérôme. Because the Darfur situation, and now that has come back again. what are they fighting for, the tribes in the region? Resources, water, grazing lands? Is there an environmental issue? It can't be just racism or just because the people have been of different ethnic, have lived in that area for a long time. What has flared it? Has the sometimes when a government favors one tribe over another, it gives them weapons, they attack. But what is there any reason from the 80s that has come back again? It can't be for nothing that they just go and massacre people.
Yeah, that's right. It can be, yeah. Well, actually, there are all of these played a role, and climate, including climate change in the 80s, there were very big droughts, which we know are now connected to man-made climate change, played a role because that pushed some tribes who in the past didn't have land and were nomads to look for land and to settle, and so there was more competition for land. But it's not because the climate is getting hot that you just kill your neighbors. Indeed, they were living together, and there were rules, and there was indeed intervention of the central government, and there was also intervention from foreign players. But in the 80s, there was also something which retrospectively in the long term was very damaging. There was an ideology called Pan-Arabism, which was maybe wrongly interpreted, but had a very strong impact in the region. And so the elite, let's say educated elite or half-educated elite from local Arab tribes with connections with Gaddafi in Libya as well. Gaddafi was very influential in shaping that narrative at some point, as well as, of course, Nasser in Egypt. They got convinced that they were somehow superior to the non-Arab tribes and should rule. And at the beginning, it was just that ideology has been called by scholar Arab supremacism. At the beginning, it looked like a few weirdos were just a few ideologues were making groups and petitioning the central government. But then the central government made them stronger, and the ideology became very, very widespread today in Chad and Sudan. I believe also different foreign players today are also can be connected to that ideology or are happy to use it or benefit from it. In particular, the United Arab Emirates. It's obvious that whether in South Libya or Eastern Chad or Sudan, yes, they are looking for land, land with gold, land with farms because they don't have an agricultural production in the Gulf. So they are looking for resources, natural resources, human resources, cheap labor, but they also are interested in playing on that supremacist ideology, which is really very damaging. So today it's very difficult to restore the dynamics from the past. That ideology is very strong. When the new war started in Sudan, as I mentioned, people believed, okay, it's just a war between the militia and the army. So there should be no racism or ideology at stake. They can just fight for power. And then the same militias in Darfur, they started to target non-Arab communities who have nothing to do with the power or with that central power role. So it was clear that they were just using the new war, the new situation, just to continue their old agenda of getting rid of some communities and taking their land and so on.
Well, I mean, the ideology is always a cover for real rewards,
There are rewards, yeah.
Yeah. And the tribes, do they live between Sudan and Chad? Is that part of are they between the tribe? The tribes are binational in some cases.
Some of them, yeah.
Yeah.
Some of the Arab tribes and some of the non-Arab tribes have been cut by the border.
Yeah. Which is because there has also had been a conflict between Libya and Chad over territories, and France had supported Chad, and Libya was fighting for some territory. So there had been a cross-border war, and so I mean there is multiple the territory had also supposedly had maybe some uranium, and Gaddafi was considering a nuclear program, which the Americans didn't want him to have, and certainly the French didn't want him to have, and the French didn't want him to have a stronger hand in Africa. And in the 90s, there was a lot of back and forth between Gaddafi extending more influence in Africa and France trying to push him away. And Sudan was sometimes had a regime that was fighting against Gaddafi, and there were times we had a regime which was in support of Gaddafi. And depending on whether the regime was pro-Gaddafi or not, if it was pro-Gaddafi, then there wouldn't be a militia against the Sudanese regime. If there was a regime that was against Gaddafi, then some militia would emerge that would fight the regime. So it was a lot of manipulation with, who gets to, whether your neighbor can have can live at peace or not, depending on the relations, and that was always, there was always some kind of oppositional form, even when your regime and your neighbor are at peace. There is always an opposition group in your neighboring country that is hosting, and vice versa. So that happened between Libya and Algeria, and Libya and Tunisia, and Sudan and Libya, and so on and so forth. So that just happens in these kinds of situations. But so there's some manipulation by external forces, which ends up affecting the populations, and the ideology, comes up as a sometimes a pretext. But go ahead, Jérôme.
Yeah, I think it's true, but I think from retrospectively, and also from let's say a field research perspective, I think it would be wrong and somehow too easy to believe the local actors, regardless of their level of education, were easily manipulated by big players. I don't think
not easily, but they play along to some degree.
I think they were actually the ones to manipulate the big players. Like I don't think Gaddafi was manipulating them. I think they were manipulating him to get what they wanted. And even for the central government of Sudan is pretty much a foreign player in Darfur. It's really something remote with no knowledge of the country. Is acting like another, like a colonizer.
An
internal colonizer. And that central government, they found they always thought they were very smart and manipulating easily the local Arab communities, and it was even somehow the narrative. It's still today the narrative for Arab communities to justify their crimes is that they were manipulated. But today they fight the central government, and they do commit the same crimes. And some of them, let's say, who are a little bit more sorry, the minority who don't back those crimes, they are making clear that actually all along they were manipulating the central government until they would get strong enough to take the world power.
Take over, yeah.
It was a plan, and a smart plan, done for many years, like for several decades, and they've been implementing it. And this is the reason why now people have come to realize that, that ideology has been very strong internally for a while, and people are mobilizing to actually fight it.
Yeah. Did you go to Port Sudan or other parts of Sudan on this visit?
No, I went to the other side. It's the road we are using to get to Darfur.
Through Libya? Yeah. Did you go through Libya, or where did you go? Juba? Huh? Abuja?
From Chad.
From Chad, okay.
From Chad, we cross the border from Chad, in the east of Chad, and then we drive into Darfur, crossing different lines between different factions.
We
reach the place where we need to go.
Okay. Any other questions about Darfur, Sudan? Okay. Yeah. All right. Well, thank you, Jérôme,
You're most
We have a very good evening in France. Are you where are you again?
I'm in Paris.
Oh, in Paris. Okay, because last time when we flew, where did we fly from again? We flew from
From Bordeaux, yeah.
from Bordeaux. Okay, last time. Yes. All right.
Exactly.
Okay,
Yeah.
great. All right. Well, we'll see you. We'll see you soon. We'll be in touch.
Hopefully, yeah.
Thank you so much. Okay, then.
Have a nice day.
Bye bye.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Bye-bye.